Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom, 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 Shalom Yerushalayim. Of Jerusalem, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Welcome back to our series on the life of the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. We have covered the first two of our 5-part series, and now we have already entered the third main division on the trial of Christ. And we noted as we began that Jesus undergoes two distinct trials, a religious trial and a civil trial, and each trial undergoes 3 stages. We were left off last time. The first stage of the religious trial was over. We now come to the second stage of the religious trial, and in your outline, you want to be on page 31, number 2, the trial before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. The passages we are after here are Matthew 26, verses 57 through 68, and Mark chapter 14, verses 53 through 65, Luke chapter 22, verses 54 to 65, and John 18:24. Caiaphas, by the way, was the son-in-law of Annas, before whom Jesus underwent the first stage of the religious trial, and he served as high priest from the year 25 till the year 36 AD. This trial takes place in AD 30 at the midpoint of his high priesthood. Now, if you look at Luke's account, verse 54, we're told that the Sanhedrin gathers into the home of the high priest. This breaks law number 6 on your list. Sanhedrin trials can only be conducted in the hall of judgment of the temple compound. As we mentioned last time, there were 71 members in the Sanhedrin, and the 71 seats were carefully divided. 24 of these seats went to the chief priests, and all 24 chief priests were Sadducees. 24 other seats went to the elders. All 24 elders were Pharisees. 22 more seats went to the scribes. All 22 scribes were Pharisees. The last one went to the high priest, himself a Sadducee. And so the trial would have been conducted by a Sadducee, but the majority vote was with the Pharisees. Also, I mentioned last time that all 71 members did not need to be present for a trial to be conducted, but you had a minimum of 23. If you had the minimum, 11 votes was sufficient to acquit. 13 votes were necessary to convict. Conviction always had to be by a majority of 2 and not 1. Now, we do not know how many of the 71 members were present at this trial. We have no idea of finding out, but we do know for sure all 71 members were not there. At least 2 members were missing, and these 2 were Nicodemus and Joseph Arimathea. The most they had then on this occasion was 69 or less. Now again, as you recall, they never expected to have to do this on this night, but Jesus forced their hand, and that's why initially things are still confused. In Mark's account, verse 55, they bring in one witness after another. Verse 55 says the whole council sought false witnesses against Jesus in Matthew verse 59. And the standard procedure with false witnesses breaks law number 7 on your list. The procedure was to be first the defense and then the accusation. It goes on to say the whole council acted in unison, and that breaks law number 8 on your list. All may argue in favor of acquittal, all may not argue in favor of guilt. They bring in one false witness after another, but there are too many discrepancies in their accounts, so one by one they are disqualified, again showing how they were unorganized, how they were not planning on doing this on this night. Finally, they do bring two witnesses that seem to say the same thing. These are the last two witnesses they have, so it's going to be sink or swim right here. These are the last two witnesses that they have that seem, at the same time, to finally give the same account. And so these are the two witnesses that are officially presented before the court. But when the two witnesses give their separate testimonies, as Mark verse 59 says, and not even so did the witness agree together. Although they seem to say the same thing initially, there was one crucial point of difference. We can catch that difference by comparing the two accounts that we have. For example, Mark verse 58 quotes one witness as saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that's made with hands, and 3 days I'll build another made without hands." Matthew quotes the other witness in verse 61 as saying, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." In other words, did Jesus say, "I am able to destroy the temple," or did he say, "I will destroy the temple"? One is a statement of ability, one is a statement of intent. It was this little difference that disqualified the last two they had. They have no more. So by rabbinic law, Jesus should have been released on this occasion. Failure to release him breaks law number 9 on your list, that to be 2 or 3 witnesses, the testimony had to agree in every detail. All of this obviously frustrates Caiaphas. So in his frustration, in Matthew verse 62 we read, "And the high priest stood up and said unto him, Answerest thou nothing? What is these witnesses against him?" And by asking Jesus to speak at this point when he didn't have 2 or 3 witnesses saying the same thing, breaks law number 10 on your list. There's to be no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. And in keeping with his Jewish civil rights, in verse 63 of Matthew, Jesus held his peace. That frustrates Caiaphas even further. And so Caiaphas says to him in Matthew verse 63, "I adjure you by the living God that should tell us whether you be the Christ, the Son of God." And he puts Jesus under the oath. And based upon what he just said to Jesus, it's obvious Caiaphas knew 2 things very clearly. Number 1, he knew exactly who Jesus claimed to be, the Messiah. And secondly, he also clearly knew who the Messiah was supposed to be, the Son of God. Now, by Jewish law, if you're placed under the oath, you must respond, and so Jesus does. And so Mark verse 62, Jesus said, "I am," meaning, yes, I am that Messiah, that Son of God. He adds in Matthew verse 64 that someday they'll know the truth of his claims in 2 ways. First, they will see him seated at the right hand of God the Father, and secondly, they'll see him coming again in the clouds of heaven. The second coming will be visible in hell itself. At that point, in Matthew verse 65, several things happen. First of all, it says, "Then the high priest rent his garments." And that breaks law number 11 on your list. The high priest was forbidden to rent his garments. Verse 65 goes on to say, saying, "He hath spoken blasphemy." And notice who originates the charge of blasphemy: Caiaphas the high priest. And that breaks law number 12 on your list. Charges could not originate with the judges. They could only investigate charges brought to them. Also in that comment, the specific charge is blasphemy. Breaking law number 13 on your list. The accusation of blasphemy was only valid if he pronounced the name of God itself, and which he did not do in the course of this trial. Then he goes on to say, "What further need have we of witnesses?" A rather magnanimous statement. He has no more witnesses. The last 2 that came the closest to serving in that capacity have been disqualified. And so he's asking the Sanhedrin to issue the verdict strictly on the basis of what Jesus said. Breaking law number 14 on your list, a person could not be condemned on the basis of his own words alone. Matthew verse 66 then asks, "They answered and said, He is worthy of death." Now, it still happens to be nighttime when they issued the verdict of guilt, and that breaks to number 15 on your list. The verdict can only be announced at night, not in the day, or cannot be announced at night, only in the daytime, and announced it at nighttime. Furthermore, this happens to be a capital offense, and by issuing the verdict the same night as the trial, breaks law number 16 on your list. In cases of capital punishment, the trial and guilty verdict cannot occur at the same time, must be separated by at least 24 hours. Furthermore, it was done by acclamation. Breaking law number 17 on your list, voting for the death penalty had to be done by individual count, beginning with the youngest. The young would not be influenced by the elders. Now, Mark verse 64 says they all condemned him. Notice the word all, showing they all voted the same way against him. And by Jewish law, it means Jesus should have been released, and the failure to release him breaks law number 18 on your list. A unanimous decision for guilt shows innocence, since it is impossible for 23 to 71 men to agree without plotting. Furthermore, they also sentence him to death as well as claim he is guilty of blasphemy. Breaking law number 19 on your list, the sentence can only be pronounced 3 days after the guilty verdict. The Mark verse 65 reads, Then some began to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to buffet him, and to say unto him, Prophesy, and the officers received him with blows of their hands. Matthew verse 67 says they did spit into his face and buffet him, and some smote him with the palms of their hands. Here you have the breaking of the last 2 laws on your list. Number 20, judges were to be humane and kind. 21, a person condemned to death could not be beaten or scourged beforehand. Now, if you combine Mark and Matthew in the verses I just read, Jesus suffers 3 indignities, which were the highest indignities under Jewish law. Some hit him with the fist, some slapped him with the palm of the hand, and some spit into his face. By Jewish law, to hit someone with your fist was punishable by a fine of 4 denarii. Now, 1 denarius was equal to 1 day's salary, so 4 denarii, 4 days' salary. More insulting was to slap someone with the palm of your hand. That was punishable by a fine of 200 denarii, 200 days' salary. And then the highest indignity was to spit into someone's face. That was punishable by a fine of 400 denarii. That's more than a year's salary. One thing is certain, no one was going to get fined on this occasion, although he did suffer the highest indignities under Jewish law. Let's go on to point 3 on your outline. We come to the 3rd stage of the religious trial, the trial before the Sanhedrin. The passages that this involves include Matthew 27, verse 1, Mark 15, verse 1, Luke 22, verses 66 to 71. The only purpose for this 3rd stage is to try to give this trial a measure of legality. By this time, apparently many had come to their senses and realized all these proceedings have been highly illegal. So to give it a measure of legality, and a very small measure at that, they wait till there is some measure of daylight. All 3 Gospels make that point. Mark verse 1, straightway in the morning. Matthew verse 1, when morning was come. Luke verse 66, as soon as it was day. Just there is some measure of daylight, the Sanhedrin reconvenes, and they question Jesus with 2 questions. The first question in verse 67 of Luke is, If you are the Christ, the Messiah, tell us. And in verses 67 through 69, Jesus answers, it's useless to tell them. They've already decided not to believe. In verse 70 comes the second question, Are you then the Son of God? He answers in verse 17, You say that I am. It's a Greek emphatic way of saying, yes, indeed, I am that Son of God. And so with this, the religious trial comes to an end, and Jesus is condemned to death on the charge of blasphemy. Which brings us to the next point on your outline, the death of Judas. It is at this point that the Sanhedrin ran into a small problem, because while blasphemy did carry the death penalty under Jewish law, it did not carry the death penalty under Roman law. Furthermore, at this point of time, the Sanhedrin no longer had the right of capital punishment. They could issue a death sentence, they could not carry that death sentence out, because the Roman Senate had taken away from the Jewish Sanhedrin the right of capital punishment. And so if Jesus was to die, he could not die under Jewish law, he could only die under Roman law. But the problem here was blasphemy did not carry the death penalty under Roman law. As I said earlier, they did not need Judas for the religious trial, but they will need him desperately for the civil trial to fulfill that third function of his we spoke of last time. But between the religious and civil trial, Judas will die. And on your notes, we have the two accounts of his death, and that's Matthew 27, verses 3 through 10, Acts chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Now, verse 3 starts out by saying, Judas, which betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself. And because it uses the word repentance, there's been some discussion as to whether at this point Judas was saved or not, since he, after all, did repent. There are two different Greek words that both mean repentance. The first Greek word is metanoia, and that word metanoia does mean salvation repentance. When that word is used, that is its implication. That's not the word used in the Greek text here. There's a different Greek word used here that is metamelomai. And metamelomai means to be filled with regret and remorse. It does not carry the concept of salvation repentance. So the point of verse 3 is that he was filled with regret and remorse, but he did not exercise salvation repentance. The answer is no, Judas was not saved. Now, as he's filled with remorse, he is so regretful that he decides to give away the 30 pieces of silver that he was paid, and when they would not take it, he simply dumps it into the temple compound. Now, unbelievers, not the critics of the New Testament, have pointed out that there are a couple of discrepancies between the Matthew account and Luke's account in Acts chapter 1, and that's one of their arguments against the inspiration of the New Testament. And I want to deal with both of these to show that from the viewpoint of the Jewish frame of reference, we don't have a contradiction, and the writings are indeed inspired of God. Now, the first discrepancy they point to is in the Matthew account in the verse 5, where it says he went away and hanged himself. So according to Matthew, Judas died by hanging. But Luke says in Acts 1:18 that falling headlong, he burst asunder the midst, all his bowels gushed out. As to use American slang, I would say he fell and his guts gushed out. So did he die by hanging, or did he die by falling with his guts gushing out? And from the perspective of Jewish law of that day, both statements are actually true. And let me get into some Jewish backgrounds here. Now keep in mind that in Jewish reckoning of time, the day does not begin at midnight as in Gentile reckoning, but at sundown. That's why the Sabbath is from sundown Friday until sundown Saturday. Once the sun has set on Saturday, Sabbath law no longer applies. That's why Jews don't wait till midnight Saturday to observe things that are forbidden on the Sabbath. Sundown Saturday is sufficient. Now, because of that system, the first night of something always came before the first day of something. The first night of Passover comes before the first day of Passover. On the first night of Passover is when every Jewish family would eat the Passover meal, as Jesus did with his apostles when he identified Judas twice as the betrayer. The next morning, which was the first day of Passover, 9 o'clock in the morning, there would be a special Passover sacrifice, and from the special Passover sacrifice, only the priesthood would be able to eat. That was how things were. But also by the laws of that day, if there was a dead body within the walls of Jerusalem, then the city was reckoned as being ceremonially unclean. As long as it was unclean, they could not proceed with the Passover sacrifice at 9 a.m. of the first day. However, there was a way to clear that up, and that was the fact that if you took the body and threw it over on the walls of Jerusalem, the wall facing the valley of Hinnom, the valley that is on the east side of the city, and then circles around to the southern side of the walled city. If they do that, and the city is reckoned as ceremonially cleansed, and they could proceed with the sacrifice, and afterwards the burial detail can go out and bury the body. So when Judas hung himself, he defiled the city. As long as his body was within the walls of the city, they could not proceed with the Passover sacrifice. And so they were throwing the body over the wall, and with that fall, his guts gushed out. And so keeping in mind the Jewish procedures of that day, there is no contradiction here. The second problem that critics have been pointing to has to do who in the world really purchased the field. Now, according to Matthew's account, after Judas tried to return the money and they wouldn't take it, he dumped it and went away and hung himself. The chief priests went ahead and used the money to purchase the field. So according to Matthew, it was the chief priest that actually purchased the field. But Luke says in Acts 1:18, now this man, meaning Judas, obtained or purchased a field with the reward of his iniquity. So Luke says Judas bought the field. So who really did buy the field? Here again, from the perspective of Jewish law, both statements are very true. Now, by Jewish law, money wrongfully gained could not be used to put into temple treasury. And that was the problem with the 30 pieces of silver. And if they received money that was wrongfully gained, then they had to return the money to the donor. However, if the donor dies before the money could be returned, they still could not put it into the temple treasury. That law, by the way, is spelled out here in Matthew's account, verse 6. It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it is the price of blood. By law, they had to return to the donor, but if the donor dies before the money could be returned, they still could not put the money into the temple treasury, but now they had to use it to purchase something for the public good, and that's what they do. They purchase a field to bury strangers in. They did something with the money for the public good. Also by Jewish law, the purchase had to be in the name of the donor, although the donor was dead. So the legal documents of sale and purchase would have the name of Judas. And legally, the chief priests were looked upon merely as the purchasing agents. So Luke tells us the issue from a legal perspective. Judas actually bought the field legally, and Matthew tells us what actually happened as the chief priest did the actual purchasing. Again, from the Jewish perspective, there is no contradiction between Matthew and Acts. Before leaving this section, let's just spend a few thoughts on the concept of 30 pieces of silver. Under the Mosaic law, in the book of Exodus chapter 21 and verse 32, if you owned an ox, and your ox gored to death your neighbor's slave, you are obligated to pay your neighbor the price of 30 pieces of silver. That was the valued price of a dead slave. As Old Testament history continued, eventually it became a symbolic price of contempt. If you wish to show contempt for someone, you would give him 30 pieces of silver, and by so doing, you were conveying you're worth as much as a dead slave is worth. In Zechariah chapter 11, verses 4 through 14, Zechariah is asked to play a messianic role, the role the Messiah would someday play, that of the Good Shepherd, and for a period of time to feed the flock of slaughter, a flock already destined for slaughter. And after a period of feeding, it was come before the Jewish leaders and say, we did not agree to a salary in advance, so simply pay what you think I'm worth. If you think my labors are worth something among you, pay accordingly. If it's worth nothing among you, then pay me nothing. It would have been less insulting to pay Zechariah nothing. They deliberately chose to pay him 30 pieces of silver. Normally, if they wished to avoid the stigma and they came close to negotiations to that price, they would settle for 29 or 31. But they liberally chose 30 to show their contempt for the prophet. How much is your work worth, Zechariah? It's worth that of a dead slave. And then God told Zechariah something. He told Zechariah, take the 30 pieces of silver and dump it into the temple compound. And then God tells him, this was the goodly price I was prized of by them. And what God told Zechariah is that, well, someday God himself will be sold out for the price of a dead slave. And when they gave Judas the 30 pieces of silver, they did sell the God-man out for the price of a dead slave. One more thing about these 30 pieces of silver. Coming from the chief priest, it meant it would have come out of the temple treasury, which was to be used for the purchase of sacrifices. That was not their intent that day, but it's exactly what they did that day. They purchased a sacrifice, the final sacrifice for sin. Let's go on to the next point in your outline, and we'll talk about the civil trial. And like the religious trial, undergoes 3 distinct stages. Now, the issue in the civil trial will not be blasphemy because, as I said, it does not carry the death penalty. The issue has to change. So the issue here will be sedition or treason against Rome. Now, I gave you 21 Jewish laws that played a role. Let me give you 2 Roman laws that played a role. Number 1, all proceedings had to be public. This one is very public, much to Pilate's soon regret. The second rule is that when a trial began, it had to begin with the prosecuting witness presenting a charge punishable under Roman law. It is here that Judas was to step forward with his charge. The first point in your outline is the first trial before Pilate. That's the first stage of civil trial. Now, Pilate was a Roman citizen who was born in Spain and served as procurator between the year 26 and 36 AD. And this trial takes place in the year AD 30, the midpoint of his procuratorship. Now, in Jewish writings from that period, he was noted for his cruelty, but always a correct Roman. And again, in spite of it being very early in the wee hours of the morning, he's dressed and ready to conduct a trial. He was expecting to do this because earlier he had released his Roman cohort to Judas. Now, John's account, verse 28, says that they therefore, from Caiaphas, brought Jesus, and they themselves entered not into the palace, they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. And the mention of eating the Passover at this point has thrown some confusion, and so some people have been teaching that Jesus must have eaten his Passover a day early. However, Jesus kept the Mosaic law perfectly. Moses clearly prescribed what day of what month the Passover had to be observed, and as a law keeper, Jesus would not have eaten it any other time than the proper time. Rather, here we're dealing with the chief priests and not the common people. As I mentioned also earlier, on the first day of Passover will be a special Passover sacrifice, which only the priesthood could eat later that day. And it's talking about the Passover sacrifice of the first day, not the Paschal meal lamb of the first night. As the trial begins, you notice in verse 29 of John's account, Pilate begins by asking a question, what accusation bring you against this man? This was in accordance with that second law. At this point, Judas was supposed to step forward and present his charge, but Judas is dead. They have no prosecuting witness. So as it is with the early stages of the religious trial, the early stages of the civil trial will also show confusion and disorganization. And their response in John verse 30 is, if this man were not an evildoer, we should not have delivered him unto you. In other words, Judas is dead. They have no prosecuting witness. They try to pressure Pilate to issue a sentence without any accusation whatsoever. At this point, Pilate, the correct Roman, will have none of it. So in the end of John verse 31, he says, verse 31, he says, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. In other words, no accusation, no trial. No trial, no sentence. No condemnation, no sentence either. Then they add, in the end of verse 31, it's not lawful for us to put any man to death, meaning no longer lawful under Roman law, because the Roman Senate had taken away from the Jewish Sanhedrin the right of capital punishment. And then note John's editorial comment in verse 32 of John, that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spake, signifying by what manner of death he. Now several times Jesus clearly prophesied that when he dies, he'll die by crucifixion. But crucifixion was not the Jewish mode of execution. Stoning was. So if Jesus died under Jewish law, he would have been stoned to death. And if he was stoned to death, he would have been rendered a false prophet. Now we know from the Talmud the exact year that the Roman Senate took away from the Jewish Sanhedrin the right of capital punishment. The Talmud says this happened, quote, 40 years before the temple was destroyed, end of quote. The temple was destroyed in AD 70, subtract 40 years, you'll come to the year AD 30, the year of the crucifixion. In other words, if this trial had taken merely 6 months earlier, then he would have been stoned to death and rendered a false prophet, and automatically a false Messiah. But in the providence of God, at the proper time, God so moved the Senate so that they passed a law forbidding the Sanhedrin to carry out the death penalty. And so now if Jesus dies, he cannot die under Jewish law, he can only die under Roman law. Now, when the leadership realizes that Pilate simply will not continue until he does have a specific charge, in Luke's account, verse 2, they finally produce it. And the charge they produce is the charge of sedition or treason against Rome on 3 counts. Number 1, they say, is perverting the nation, meaning he's fomenting revolt. Secondly, he forbids giving tribute to Caesar, which itself is an act of treason. And thirdly, claims to be a king, and by claiming to be a king himself, it means he is a competitor to Caesar. Well, now that Pilate has a specific charge, he can continue with the trial, and in the Roman procedure, once an official charge was presented, you have the interrogation or questioning of the accused. So going back to John's account, at the end of verse 33 of John's account, Pilate asked him the question, are you the king of the Jews? Pilate is not asking Jesus, are you the Messiah? From a Roman perspective, that's not where it's coming from. Where it's coming from is, are you really a competitor to Caesar? To make sure the issue is clear, Jesus asked him a question in verse 34 of John. Sayest thou this of yourself, or dost tell it concerning me? In other words, at what basis are you asking me this question? From the viewpoint of a Roman or the viewpoint of a Jew? And in verse 35, Pilate responds, am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priest delivered you unto me. What have you done? Now Pilate's response is, I'm asking the basis of what the Jewish leaders accuse you of. I'm asking you my question from the viewpoint of a Roman. Are you really a competitor to Caesar? Now the issue is clear. Jesus answers in verse 36, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that should not be delivered unto the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence, or not from now. Simply put, no, I am not a competitor to Caesar, and that for 2 reasons. The first reason is my kingdom is not of this world. Now, in many circles of the evangelical Christian church, there is a teaching that while Jesus will indeed come back someday, he's not coming back to establish any earthly kingdom, and there will be no earthly kingdom on this earth, and there is no special ethnic future of the Jewish people like a final restoration into land of Israel. And this is one of their favorite evidences, because they say even Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world," which they interpret to mean that there is no literal earthly kingdom ever to be in this world. However, there's a world of difference between saying "of the world" and "in the world." We're not trying to respond merely using semantics, because Jesus himself made that distinction only one chapter earlier in John 17. Speaking both of himself and of his disciples, he said, "We are in the world, we are not of the world." There is a difference. To be of the world means to be of this world's nature, and we believers are no longer of this world's nature. Now, as long as we're alive, we are in the world, but we are no longer of it. And the kingdom that he'll come back with will not be a kingdom of this world. It's not of this nature. He's not merely coming to depose Caesar from Caesar's throne and then sit upon Caesar's throne. He's come with his own throne, the throne of David, and his own kingdom. His kingdom will indeed someday be in the world, but never be of it. That's the first reason why he's not comparative to Caesar. The second reason is, my kingdom is not from hence, not from now. As we've seen, the second main division of this study on the conflict with the Pharisees, when they rejected him, the offer of the Messianic kingdom was rescinded. And so, as a result of that rescinding, the kingdom would not be established at this point of time anyway, but a much later time. So, for these two reasons, his kingdom is not of this, for these two reasons, he's no competitor to Caesar. Pilate then responds in verse 37, "Are you a king then? Are you a king in any sense of the term?" And in verse 37, Jesus answers, "Yes, in one sense, I'm a king even now. I'm a king of the truth. And all those who are of the truth hear my voice." But at this point, as far as Pilate is concerned, the issue is over, and he responds rather a sarcastic comment in John verse 38, "What is truth?" And what is so sad for Pilate is this: at this very moment, he was looking at the truth and failed to recognize him where he stood. But he comes out, and in Luke's account, verse 4, issues the first of several declarations of innocency. As far as Pilate is concerned, Jesus is no threat to Rome. In Mark's account, verse 3, after this first declaration of innocency, they begin yelling out all kinds of other accusations against him. And in Mark verse 4, the response of Jesus is a response of silence. He will not respond. And when Pilate asks him to answer these accusations, Jesus, in Mark verse 5, simply refuses to respond. But as these accusations continue being yelled out, suddenly in Luke's account, verse 5, someone happens to mention that Jesus originates from the Galilee. And the mention of Jesus' Galilean origins provides Pilate a way out of this dilemma. Because while Judea and Samaria were under his jurisdiction, the Galilee was not under his jurisdiction. That was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas also happened to be in Jerusalem for the Passover for maintaining order. And so Pilate sends Jesus to Antipas to get the case settled. Which brings the next point on your outline, which we have the second stage of the civil trial, the trial before Herod. This Herod was called Herod Antipas, A-N-T-I-P-A-S. He was a son of Herod the Great, and Herod the Great was the one who tried to have Jesus killed when he was only 2 years old in Bethlehem, and this is that Herod's son. About a year and a half earlier, he happened to be the one who beheaded John the Baptist. Only after his execution of John did he begin hearing about the miracles of Jesus, and for a while came to believe that Jesus might be John the Baptist raised from the dead, and was very much afraid that was the case. And all because he began hearing about these miracles. For a very long time he wanted to see Jesus, even sent for Jesus at one time, but Jesus turned the invitation down by saying, "Go and tell that fox no." But now he finally has this chance. He finally sees Jesus standing right there in front of him, and of course, what he wants is to see some of these miracles he'd been hearing about. In other words, he wants a performance. He wants Jesus to entertain him with these miracles, which of course Jesus refuses, because miracles are never for the purpose of entertainment. And that's a lesson that is to be learned today. Miracles are never for the purpose of entertainment. So instead he reduces Jesus to mockery, and the second stage of the civil trial ends with a second declaration of innocency. As far as Antipas is concerned, Jesus is no threat to Rome either. Now verse 12 says, "And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before there was enmity between themselves." And the reason for the enmity is because of things that happened when Pilate first became procurator. He rode into Jerusalem with his Roman legions, and around the outer temple compound wall he erected the Roman shields, which had images of man, animals, gods, and goddesses, which of course went contrary to Jewish sensitivities about images and idols and polytheism. And as a result, a great riot broke out in Jerusalem, and Pilate released his soldiers, causing many to die, but he refused to remove those shields. Antipas happened to be a nominal convert to Judaism and knew as long as those shields were out there, there would be a constant point of irritation and would be excuses for agitation of revolt. He asked Pilate to take the shields down. Pilate again refused. So Antipas wrote a letter of complaint to the Roman Senate, and finally the Senate ordered Pilate to take those shields down, and now he had no choice. As a result, there were enmity among themselves, between themselves, because they felt each was failing to recognize each other's authority. But now that Pilate sent the Galilean to one in charge of Galilee, there was a recognition of mutual authority. They become friends at Christ's expense. 9 years later, in the year 39 AD, his wife Herodias convinced her husband to travel to Rome with her and ask from the Roman Senate the title of king. They gave that title to his father Herod the Great. She wanted that title for her husband. This way she could become the queen of Judah. But the emperor at that time was a man named Caligula, and he made no such requests from Caligula. He was an insane madman, and during his short rule, the streets of Rome flowed freely with blood. And every time he was running low on funds, he would make a false accusation against a wealthy senator or landowner, have everyone executed, and take over the property. Things finally got so bad that his own Praetorian Guard that was there to protect him were the ones who ended up assassinating him. And so that's the kind of man Caligula was. He was so insane he made his own horse a member of the Roman Senate. And conveniently, that horse, by the way, always voted his way as well. So when these two came, asked him the title of king or queen, he banished them to Gaul, and they died in abject poverty, paying the price for the beheading of John and the mocking of Jesus. Now we come to the third stage of this civil trial, the second trial before Pilate. At this point, Pilate is going to make several specific attempts to have Jesus released. The first attempt is in Luke's account, verse 14 and 15, which shows the third declaration of innocency, but that fails to appease. The second attempt he makes to have Jesus released is in John's account, verse 39, offering them a choice. It had become a practice that at Passover time, the Romans would release a Jewish prisoner as a goodwill gesture. It just so happened that besides Jesus, there was another Jewish prisoner whose name was Barabbas. And if you look at Mark verse 7, you will notice that Barabbas was guilty of the very crime that Jesus accused of, the crime of sedition and treason against Rome. Mark verse 7 says he led an insurrection against Rome. Murder was committed, and he and some others were captured. You notice also that Barabbas is referred to in John's account, verse 40, as a robber. That would not be a very good translation because robbery was not punishable by death anyway. That should be malefactor or rebel and not robber as such. Now there is some irony here because Barabbas, by the way, is not a name, it's a title. Barabbas is a Hellenization of two Aramaic words, Bar, B-A-R, which means son of, and then Abba, A-B-B-A, which was this man's name. So he was somebody, the son of Abba. The Gospels do not tell us what his real name was, probably to avoid confusing the reader. From secular sources in history, we know what his name actually was. His name was also Yeshua or Jesus. He had the very same name as the other one. So two men are named Jesus. One is guilty of insurrection, one is merely accused of it. But the irony goes further. Because while this man's father's name was Abba, that was his actual father's name, the word itself also means something. It means the Father. His full name and title was Jesus, the Son of the Father. He only had the title, not the reality. He's guilty of insurrection. But the true son of the true father is innocent but accused. It's rather obvious that Pilate anticipates that they would certainly ask for the Nazarene as they were against Barabbas. As he's presenting the choice in Matthew's account, verse 19, the procedure has a very short interruption when he gets a message from his wife warning him not to get too deeply involved with this situation because of a dream she had. And this interruption is long enough for the event of verse 20 to take place. In Matthew verse 20, leaders begin filtering through the masses to tell them to ask for Barabbas, which they do, and so the second attempt to have Jesus released fails. Then in John chapter 19, verse 1, he makes the third attempt to have Jesus released by offering a compromise of scourging. It simply says, Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. That's all he says. That's all that was needed to say when the Gospels were written, because back then everyone knew what a scourge entailed. But many people don't know what a scourge entails today, so we fail to appreciate the measure of his physical sufferings before he ever made it to the cross. So let's think about this for a few moments. Now, there were two kinds of scourges practiced back then, a Jewish scourge and a Roman scourge. The Jewish scourge was called 40 save 1. Why 40 save 1? By Jewish law, no one could be whipped more than 40 times, and so the rabbis were concerned about breaking that commandment, and the issue came up. Suppose the whipper is whipping, and he counts but miscounts and gives the victim 41 and breaks the law. And so to avoid that possibility, they stopped at 39 to play it safe. A Jewish scourge was consisted of a handle made of wood or leather with short leather strands, and only part of the victim's body affected was his back. And while it was very painful, it was never deadly. And no one ever died of a Jewish scourge. And we are told that Paul himself suffered the Jewish scourge 5 different times, survived them all. But Jesus here suffers not the Jewish scourge, but the Roman scourge, far more severe, a full 40 lashes, a wooden handle with or leather handle, but the strands of leather were very strong, they were very long, wrapping around the whole body. At the end of each leather strand was a piece of metal or glass or nail or lamb bone. So after only a few lashes, the skin was torn away, the muscle exposed. After some more lashes, the muscle torn away and the bones exposed. And the whole body was affected, front, back, sides, and face. There are many misconceptions people get from crucifixion paintings. Here's one of them. They always show Jesus' face basically intact. it would not have been intact. It would have been a lacerated mass. In fact, it was so lacerated that, according to records, that family members of a victim often could not recognize the person anymore because of all those lacerations of the face. But this fulfills a messianic prophecy in Isaiah 52, verses 13 through 15, that said, "His visage was so marred or so disfigured, he no longer resembled a man." As if that was not enough, the soldiers know that he's accused of specifically of claiming to be a king and therefore competitor to Caesar. So in John verse 2 and 3, they put a purple robe about him, and they also make him a crown of thorns. And to appreciate this, you must know what thorns are like in Israel. They come to a sharp point, sometimes razor sharp. If you brush against one lightly, you could bleed. Our lacerated face, they put it on lightly even. It would already cause pain, but said they kept striking him. If they struck the crown of thorns and the thorns dug deeper, it will cause the pain all the more. There's also a symbolism here that should not be missed, because thorns is the symbol of the Adamic curse. In his sufferings, he's bearing the Adamic curse upon himself. With all that out of the way, Pilate hopes this is sufficient, and in John verse 4, he issues a fourth declaration of innocency. But they still cry out for the crucifixion in John verse 5 and 6. So then Pilate makes his fourth attempt to have Jesus released at the end of verse 6, when he refuses to issue the Roman sentence. So at that point, they drop the charge of sedition, and they bring up the real issue that's been troubling them all along in John verse 7. "We have alone by the law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." The charge of sedition is dropped. They go back to the real issue. He claims to be the Messiah. Now that Pilate has a brand new charge, he must have a new interrogation, which he tries to have in verses 8 through 11 of John's account. But this time, Jesus will not answer any more of his questions, because by this time Pilate had received sufficient light to respond correctly. He responded incorrectly with his sarcastic "what is truth?" Now no further light will be given. When Pilate presses him to answer because he says, "I've got the authority to condemn you or release you," Jesus reminds him, all civil authority originates from heaven. He only has delegated authority, and furthermore, those who turned him over to Pilate will be guilty of the greater sin. In verse 12 of John's account, he then makes the fifth attempt to have Jesus released. Upon this, Pilate sought to release him. But his fifth attempt fails when they cry out to him, "If you release him, you're not Caesar's friend." And notice Pilate's response to that seemingly empty cry, "If you release him, not Caesar's friend." Verse 13, when Pilate therefore, meaning for the very reason he heard these words, what words? "If you release him, you're not Caesar's friend," he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat. And from the judgment seat, a sentence has to be issued along with the verdict. The question is, why would he be intimidated by this seemingly empty crime? Well, if you release him, you're not really Caesar's friend. What does he care what they think? We understand the situation if we go back to the situation in Rome at this point of time. Now, Pilate received his job as procurator from a friend named Sejanus. Now, Sejanus and Pilate were close personal friends, and when Sejanus became the captain of the Praetorian Guard, an influential position, he used his influence to get Pilate the job of procurator. But then Sejanus thought it'd be nice if he was the emperor. He developed a conspiracy to assassinate the Emperor Tiberius and become the emperor himself, but the conspiracy was discovered. He was executed along with some other co-conspirators. And now the Senate was investigating everybody connected with Sejanus, which would include Pontius Pilate. The last thing Pilate needs at this moment is for word to get back to Rome. He'll release someone that was claiming to be a king and therefore Caesar's competitor. So that's intimidating him enough to take his place on the judgment seat. From the judgment seat in John verse 14, he makes his sixth and last attempt to have Jesus released by bringing Jesus out and saying, "Behold your king." But they respond in John verse 15, "We have no king but Caesar." And with this action, they disown the Messiah as their king and own Caesar as their king. And Pilate at this point gives up and makes no further attempts to release him. But in Matthew verse 24, he calls for a pitcher of water and he washes his hands in the pitcher of water, assuming he could simply remove his guilt by immersing his hands in water, but it's not the case. From a purely human perspective, the final decision whether Jesus would live or die was in the hands of Pontius Pilate. He alone could make that decision. He knew what the right decision should have been, and he chose to allow himself to be intimidated to make the wrong one. And so merely putting his hands in water does not release him. And in fact, when Peter preaches his message in Acts chapter 3, he names several people responsible for the death of the Messiah, and among them he names Pontius Pilate. 6 years later, he himself was banished to Gaul by Caligula, where he committed suicide and paid the price for this miscarriage of justice. At the end of verse 24 of Matthew, he makes his fifth declaration of innocency, this righteous man, and of the 5 declarations is the most significant because it was made from the judgment seat. And they respond in verse 25, "His blood be upon us and our children." They take upon themselves the curse of the blood, but it is limited to them and their children. It goes no further. In the year AD 70, when the judgment fell for the unpardonable sin, it fell upon them and their children. At this point, Luke verse 24, he sentences Jesus to death. In Luke verse 25, he has Barabbas released. And there's a symbol here, the guilty one goes free because the innocent one will die in his place. At the end of Luke verse 25, he turns Jesus over to be crucified. And so ends the 2 trials of Christ. He's now ready to move on to a next major division, the death of the Messiah, which will begin next time.